We are starting our first Fireside Chat, and I am absolutely delighted to have a special guest and a good friend. Now, I first knew Ambassador Lippert as a national security expert and a DOD kind of geek. He was Chief of Staff to then Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. He had been Chief of Staff at the National Security Council. He was a Navy SEAL. He spent some time on the Hill. Clearly he's an overachiever. Most recently, he has held senior executive positions at YouTube, at the Boeing Corporation, and currently today he is Executive Vice President at Samsung Electronics America. And did I forget to mention in between, he found time to be America's ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2014 to 2017. So Mark has an incredible career, both from the U.S. policy perspective as well as how it intersects with the private sector. He's got an incredible background of experience, and I'm really excited to get a chance to ask him some questions. We only have 30 minutes, and I will preview that he's not at his best right now. He's got a little bit of food poisoning, so please don't be mean to him. Or I will have to come after you because he's my friend. But I'm just going to jump right in. Ambassador Lippert, do you want to make any opening remarks or?
Well, I guess what I'd say is, well, first, Tami, thank you for having me. I don't know if you remember this, but the first time I met you was when I was a junior congressional staffer pulled out by the Korean government to go to Korea and do one of these no-dells, as they call them, and the individual who shepherded us around is a guy named Wee-Sung Lak, who is now a very important. He got all the way up to vice foreign minister. He was the ROK ambassador to Russia, and now he's a leading member of the National Assembly and could, if the progressives win, could easily be the deputy national security advisor, or a foreign minister. So all roads run through the foreign minister to Tami. That's the bottom line. So, and it's great to be back here. It reminds me of when I worked for Boeing. It's fantastic. So good to see everybody. And look, I'll just say this: it's a really important time, right? It's an important time for the alliance. It's an important time for technology policy. It's an important time for trade, economic and commercial policy, and it's really important that NBR convene this. Thank you to Michael for hosting this. I just think this is exactly what institutions like NBR need to be doing at this critical point in, I would say, history. Not to be over dramatic, but I do think it's an important point. Let me just over back to you, Tami.
Thank you. So you're now with Samsung, a key player in the global semiconductor industry that's facing a high degree of uncertainty. We've got supply chain disruptions, export controls, industrial policy efforts to reshape global manufacturing, and now we have the Trump effect. What do you see as the key challenges facing your industry in this space, and any ideas? Where are we going?
Sure, great question. And I mean, what makes Samsung interesting is everybody goes to semiconductors because it's kind of I wouldn't say hot issue, but it's top of mind for a lot of policymakers. But across this giant conglomerate, we do a whole bunch of manufacturing that is potentially impacted by geopolitics, geoeconomics, right, and technological trends as well. And just quickly, just for those who don't know, we do, obviously, everybody knows our phones and home appliances. We do biologics, actually. We're a CDMO. Not many people know about Samsung Biologics, but it's a really important and dynamic company. We do display technologies, which a lot of Apple phones actually have them on there, and a whole bunch of other things like 5G network technology. So we're in there. We also own a baseball team that I aspire to play shortstop for, but in the Korean Baseball League. But those days probably are behind me, maybe for my son or something. But the point is I would say complex, dynamic, and I would say evolving environment in which we find ourselves in has tremendous. I would say it has an impact on the way we think internally, right? And we're constantly looking about this. Now, what I would say, what's interesting here is Samsung is, I wouldn't say used to this, but has dealt with a lot of different types of geopolitical cleavages, events in its history. I mean, you think about it, it was founded early days by the current head, J.Y. Lee's grandfather, who worked really hard to get a business going, then had the business completely wiped out by the Korean War, had to reconstitute the business, right? So the origins of Samsung are one of upheaval. Samsung had to manage the transition to democracy in the Republic of Korea, the end of the Cold War, the Asian financial crisis, right? And obviously now we're into this post-Cold War era, the pandemic, you name it, this company's been through it, right? So what I would say is one of its core competencies is identifying trends, staying as nimble as possible. You know, we are in manufacturing, we're not an algorithm-based company, so it's not the easiest thing in the world, but I think it is something that Samsung excels at. And finally, trying to then, in the midst of all of that, be a leader in manufacturing processes and technology, right? And I think that's the goal, right? And we do have a long history of doing that. What I would say, what are we focused on more on the semiconductor side, you know, taking the geopolitical and making it very real here in the United States. Obviously STEM talent, right, is critical. Then there's been a lot of work on that with the Biden administration, and I anticipate with the Trump administration going forward, right? Actually, a Boeing executive once told a bunch of us here, and I thought he nailed it. He said, you know, we compete against Airbus, we compete against Lockheed, but really what the competition is about STEM talent. There's only so much of this talent to go around globally, and whoever gets the best of it is going to win, right? Or be the most competitive. And I think getting a really robust STEM talent workforce in place is critical. You know, this is more me than I would say this is my personal view, not the company's, but the company is interested in this. But Senator Young wrote a really interesting piece in the National Interest. I'll probably reference it a couple times because there are elements in there. And he makes the case for public sector spending on R&D, right? He basically says, you know, you got the CHIPS and Science Act funded, but the science part didn't get funded, right? And, you know, the history of the United States in building up this ecosystem that for a long time was, and I would still argue today, you know, a proud semiconductor ecosystem was public funding for the microelectronics commons, if it will, right, as it were. So I think that's really important too. I'd also say, you know, the right mix of incentives and market forces, I think is important, right? You know, there is something about smart industrial policy that, you know, kind of fills market failure gaps, right, but doesn't overly dictate, you know, where the market is headed and create unnecessary economic distortions. I mean, you're going to have some distortions by the industrial policy that you effectuate anyway, and I think many are willing to accept that because of national security or foreign policy concerns or geopolitical or domestic employment concerns. But over-rotating on that is important. Not over-rotating on that is important as well. Final couple of things I would say. Obviously, the more predictable, you know, more transparent, more rules-based the business climate is, the better it is for businesses. That just goes without saying. It's almost self-evident. But again, I think Samsung's quite good at managing ups and downs, as its history has shown. And then finally, what I would say just to the U.S. government and other governments who get into this space, especially on export controls, that I think, you know, export controls and industrial policy. The type of export controls that the U.S. government is putting forward and the type of industrial policy, meaning that we really have only done this in our recent history in the Defense Department space, and having worked in two jobs, one as Assistant Secretary, one as Chief of Staff to the DOD it's a mixed bag over there, right? I mean, there's no doubt. Interesting place to work, but don't always get it right. And I think the government's ability to be flexible, to react, respond, because, you know, you're promulgating rules and regulations that are impacting global institutions, global corporations, far away from your shores. You're acting with an understatement, incomplete information, right? And you're driving towards outcomes using highly complicated policy tools, regulations that come out that are 250 pages, right? And so I think there's got to be a willingness to be adaptable, right? And let me just get off the stage by saying, I cite this, it dates me, but I cite this study all the time of CNAS, Richard Danzig, former Navy Secretary, one of the smartest guys I've ever met. He wrote a report called Driving in the Dark, right? And Danzig basically says, and I'm going to butcher it, basically says, we don't predict the world very well. We're dealing with information, incomplete information, DOD, we try to judge the threats well, but, and so we go out and make an assessment. Then we gear these long pipelines of procurement that last 10, 20, 30 years. And by the time it spits out, after, we've upgraded the requirements and changed through the JROC process, time it spits out, the weapon system is not really effective for the environment we're in, right? Or it's grossly overpriced, and or we cut the buy. So his point is, what we need to do is just be more adaptive, right? Drive in the dark, be more flexible, be more adaptive, and I think that's one thing that both policymakers and industry alike could find common ground on. Let me stop there.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn to the audience. Again, we have him until 11 o'clock, so get your questions ready. Mark, China is increasingly emerging as a competitor higher and higher up the technology value chain. And we're recently seeing growing concerns about overcapacity across a major range of sectors. How do you view the current situation in areas such as displays, batteries, and what are the economic, innovation, and security risks that this poses?
I mean, I think this is a pretty straightforward answer, and it doesn't really just apply to China. It applies writ large around the globe. Look, I mean, I would argue that there's just been a lot of good that has come out of free, fair, open competition over the years and a rules-based international order, right? And that has served us well. And I spent 20 years in the U.S. government defending said rules-based international order. Now, are there disagreements? Do some countries go right and left with it? Yes, but by and large, if you have a critical mass of countries working within that framework, it's a good thing, right? And so when that is threatened, you get distortions, you get issues, you get problems, and you get responses, right? And you see the Biden administration on the way out the door, 301 action on memory. You see reports out on display. You just see a whole lot of action gearing up, right? And that is the consequence of that. So I'm going to keep it simple there and just say, rules-based international order that facilitates free and open commerce, is generally a good principle worth adhering to, and something that, I think is, at least in my professional career, was worth fighting for. And let me stop there.
Okay, I'm opening it to the crowd. Who would like to ask the burning question? Okay, while you're thinking, I will move on. Korea has shown an increasing desire to take on a larger regional responsibility role, including in tech and innovation. And again, you work for one of the icons there. Where do you think Korea could be particularly effective in this role, and how are current developments in the U.S. impacting Korea's leadership role in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it can go big to small here, right? But I think what's so interesting about Korea is the democratic development model that it has undertaken is arguably the most successful in the world, right? In history, right? It's this unbelievable story. And in the midst of all of that, they were able to be a leader of technology and a whole bunch of other industries, right? And I think with the first and foremost, I would say, here is a country that, I think it's a big country. They are self-styled, and the Koreans don't often think of themselves as a big country. But what I would say is that here's a country that is, not one of the big international powers that necessarily shapes the rules, but it succeeded, right, in this environment. Number one. Number two, they did it while transitioning to democracy and a very robust democracy, right? As we've seen in Korea pretty recently, right? And so I would say that there's a values-based proposition and a country that has generally moved towards, it's not perfect, right? Greater participation among, different communities, civic organizations, a growing civil society, robust, very robust press. So I think that's point one. I think second, I've always felt that the Koreans have a very special relationship in Southeast Asia. Many of these countries who are grappling with some of these issues as they move up the development chain, and the Koreans are well respected in Asia. And I even got it some in Africa when I was serving as a military officer. People would ask me, and it's funny, I remember I was talking about Korea and some time I spent there doing kind of these no-dells, and they said, well, how did they do it? They're amazing. It's just an amazing story. And you get that a lot in Southeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and I would say to a lesser extent, even in parts of Africa. So I'd say the leadership and helping other countries, being an example, I think that's the second thing that they can do. And then I think the third thing is continue, now that they are a leader and they've come out on the other end in technology, is continue to make their voice heard in these international institutions, multilateral organizations, standard setting, arguments about how to regulate, things like quantum computing, coming in on trying to figure out the right strategy on things like export controls and industrial policy, because they've done it themselves. They have experience doing it. So it's that bucket, those kind of 2 or 3 buckets of issues where you can really see South Korean leadership emerge and I think be a force on the international scene.
Okay, audience. Please, go ahead. Come on, Andrew. Actually, just go for it. I don't think we have anybody online.
So one of the last acts of the Biden administration was to issue this AI diffusion framework. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what recommendations you have for current administration on fate of that.
I mean, that's a really, really hard question. I mean, there's kind of the company answer, there's the Mark Lippert answer. I guess what I would say is I don't really have a good answer on AI diffusion because, I mean, first, what I would say is I think we're still trying to figure out the impacts of this thing, right? I guess what I would say, that would be my recommendation would be, look, very interesting effort by the Biden team at the end, right? That plus, remember, you have the kind of the foundry rule, the foundry transparency rule or foundry, those two hit almost at the end, right? And, those are big, complicated pieces of business, right, that have all sorts of impacts. And I think we're just sort of figuring out. So I think my biggest thing would be, let's everybody take a breath, study the regulations, and then let's figure out a process by which we can make amendments as necessary, right? It comes back to this, and let's make sure that, look, the underlying principle of this is obviously folks are worried about China, but let's not let a political debate, right? Which, there's strong bipartisan support in Washington for China, but let's make sure that in the midst of that, there's also careful technocratic analysis of a rule that is big, broad, and frankly deals with technologies that I think we're still grappling with. I should ask you the same question, Andrew, actually. It's not very... All right, fair enough.
Olivia, a microphone's coming.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your comments today. Olivia here from FMC Congressional Study Group on Korea and George Washington University. I had a question. In your perspective, how do you think the current political turmoil in the ROK might affect their future or ongoing leadership in terms of tech and its position abroad advocating for technology-related issues?
Yeah, I'm probably the wrong guy to ask on this because I'm hopelessly optimistic on Korean democracy, right? I just believe in it, right? And I feel like I went through it as ambassador in 2016, 2017 with the Park Geun-hye impeachment. Here we are 7 years later, and you have some of the Conservative Party going to Park Geun-hye's residence and asking her for advice, right? And so there's this, very, robust nature of Korean democracy that I just find compelling. Now, it's not to say it's not perfect. There's, the country's, pretty divided, right, among left and right. But, you look at the last election and Yoon Suk-yeol beats Lee Jae-myung by, fraction, right? And the votes are counted, a winner's declared, the loser concedes, all within like 4 hours, right? And everybody, I wouldn't say has moved on because there's still a lot of political fighting over that election. And you can argue Koreans like to fight about elections past a lot. It kind of piles up, but the democracy works. So my answer is, let's see where we are at the end of this process. But my guess is that we are going to have a strong Korean government. Now, I think the question then becomes, what are the policies, right? And that remains to be seen. But look, both camps, I would say, and it's not clear who will emerge, because you still have some court cases, you have a whole bunch of wickets to jump through. But you have, let's put it this way, when you look out and look at the advisors and some of the people who would be in those camps, there are people with very, very solid technology backgrounds, very, very solid trade and commercial backgrounds. So again, I'm optimistic. And I'll end with one story quickly, because it's what ambassadors do. They tell long, boring stories. But there was this in 2016 when there was all these protests on Gwanghwamun. It's near the ambassador's residence, and I walked out of the residence, and my dog, we wanted to go to Namsan, it's this basset hound. And he instead pulls towards, there's a bunch of food, cheapo, and he pulls towards that in the middle, and the reporter catches me with a camera, and I'm, we're just wearing Doosan Bears baseball stuff, and the internet went sort of crazy. It went viral. Said, well, he's there. He's disrupting a funeral. No, he's protecting the protesters. No, I'm still getting questions about that. Today, I did a speech in Washington 2 weeks ago, and somebody in their 20s walked out and said, what were you doing on that walk? And I said, was that really to protect democracy? And my answer is always, Korean democracy is a lot more resilient than a single basset hound, and all in there. So there you go.
Well, I'm glad to know that Rigsby got his walk in.
Got
That's
his
the
walk
important
in.
thing. Last question to the Consul General, Ms. So. Microphone's coming.
Hello, Ambassador Lippert. Taking this opportunity, I would like to, extend my sincere appreciation to your contribution as the ambassador to Korea. This time, the Trump administration point out the cooperation area with Korea is the shipbuilding industry or steel industry or the Alaska LNG, the industry, something like that. So I would like to know your opinion on that cooperation in this field. And also what kind of the leverage do you think we have in cooperation with the Trump administration? Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question. Really, it's great to see you here, and congratulations on the posting. I guess what I would say is, probably not the best thing to do to negotiate in public, but what I would say on Korea is that I do feel Korea has a lot of areas where it can work closely with the Trump administration, right? And, you look at some of the people in the NSC, Ivan, who does the East Asia, portfolio there. You look at David Feith, who does the technology and national security. These are people who believe in alliances, right? So I think the first point is that there are people in the administration that believe strongly in alliances, right? And to me, it's all about trying to empower those individuals, right, as they work their way through the interagency process. Right now, the other thing too is we haven't seen a whole lot of the agency in Senate confirmed agency figures populate, right? The undersecretaries, that will help, right? Michael DeSambra is a pretty interesting guy. I've met him a number of times, did a really good job in Thailand. So I think it's, one is working with those people, two, bringing the issues that you mentioned, Consul General, to the table, right? You've got shipbuilding, you've got LNG. The other thing too is you've got all these critical technologies that are really, really important for the United States, right? And that the United States, generally speaking, doesn't manufacture enough of, right? And so there's a lot to work with there in the Republic of Korea. I think, the key then is figuring out a way around some of the trade issues. Easier said than done, but again, working through the process last time, the Koreans were relatively successful. So I think you start with a pretty strong baseline in that you are a country that is, I think, respected globally, can purchase and or provide certain things that the United States really needs in it to be crass technology. And last point, has a lot of friends in the U.S., has a lot of friends in the U.S., right? The U.S.-Korea alliance has institutions, constituencies that have been built up for decades, right? And, you know, those friends matter, right? And it's easy to be friends when it's sunny and you're in a bar on Friday drinking a beer, but it's another thing to have friends on Wednesday at 2 in the morning when it's freezing cold and you have food poisoning. And let me just tell you, the Republic of Korea has those friends that will show up at 2 in the morning. And again, I remain optimistic. Let me stop there.
What a great way to end this panel. Please join me in thanking Ambassador Mark Lippert.